Welcome back to the next video on the so-called accelerated Panov attack. As the name suggests, it is closely related to the Panov attack and it can even transpose many times. But it is an opening on its own, with its own typical plans and with its own body of theory. We can arrive to the starting position via the moves e4, c6, c4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, c takes d5, and here white gonna have a few different options. But before we gonna take a look at those, there are a few things to mention. First of all, if white plays the move d4 here, actually that would be a direct transposition to the Panov attack, with which we are dealing in a separate video. White could also play the move c takes d5 first, and on e takes d5, e takes d5, that would be just a different move order to get to the accelerated Panov attack. And lastly, white could also play the move 1c4. Obviously this is the English opening and totally outside of our repertoire, but I just wanted to mention if there are some Slav players out there who were thinking about playing the move c6 here, with the idea of meeting d4 with d5 and with that transposing to the Slav defense, but they were afraid to do so because here white could play the move e4. Now they're gonna be good to go and they're gonna have an extra move against 1c4, because here we just transposed to our Caro-Kann defense and we just gonna check out all the lines in this opening. So let's just go back to our original move order, and that is with 1 e4, c6, c4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, c takes d5, and here we don't want to take back on d5 with the queen, because the queen would be kicked around after the move knight c3. We would do so many tempes in the opening and that's really not advisable. But we do have the move knight f6 available with the idea of taking on d5, and here white has to make a choice. I believe the moves which would make sense in the accelerated Panov attack for white here are either bishop b5 check or queen a4 check, with the idea of luring one of our minor pieces to d7, and with that lessening the pressure on the d5 pawn, because that would cut off our queen. Or else white could play the move knight c3, but here we can take on d5 right away and we just kind of transpose to the Panov attack after such moves like d4, for example, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4. This is something what we covered in a separate video. Or white could try some other moves, and that could be like bishop c4. And here we have to be a tiny bit careful, because if you looked at the Panov video, you might remember that many times I'm suggesting a setup with bishop e6, g6, bishop g7, which would be ideal here as well. Bishop e6 is just very well timed whenever there is a bishop on c4, due to the fact that we are already threatening to take on c3 and pick up the bishop, and with that we are gaining some time. But here it turns out that our queen side is abandoned, and after the move queen b3, we are in some kind of trouble due to the fact that there is a pressure on the b7 pawn, and also there is a pressure on the g8, a2 diagonal. Hence, we have to take a different approach here, and I think the best move, probably the simplest move here, is to play the move knight b4. We have a pretty straightforward plan of playing knight d3 check, and white is not well prepared to meet that. He can play the move d3, which would stop us from going knight d3, but here we're just gonna follow up with bishop f5, hitting the d3 pawn once again. And on the move knight f3, actually it turns out that if we were to take on d3, white might get a decent compensation. But luckily for us, we are already in time to play the move e6, because we are not closing in the c8 bishop, and hence we can have a comfortable development, and white is the one who still have the isolated pawn on d3, which gonna be a drawback for a long time for him. So for example, after the moves castle, knight c6, bishop g5, bishop e7, takes, and a3, we can just drop back the knight to c6, and with that achieve a very comfortable and equal position. Now let's just go back, and interestingly enough, white can even try to let us to give knight d3 check in this position, and instead of the move d3, he can play knight f3. But obviously we're gonna go ahead and play knight d3 check, and on the move king e2, we're gonna take on c1. White takes it back, and after the moves e6, d4, bishop d6, white gonna be in time to castle by hand and solve the problem of his king, but also black will have no problem whatsoever. We do have the pair of bishop, we're gonna be able to finish up development, and also we already exchanged down one pair of minor pieces, which really favors us, because white is the one with the IQP, and he's the one who is striving for some dynamic plays, and for that he needs those minor pieces. So after the moves rook e1, castle, king f1, knight d7, king g1, knight b6, bishop b3, and bishop d7, we do have a very comfortable position. We have some ideas with bishop c6, rook c8, and really there is nothing to fear with black. I just go back, and instead of the move bishop c4, I think white probably should do something else here, and that might be a move like knight f3, but here once again I believe we're just gonna transpose back to the Panov attack after the moves knight c6, d4, and bishop g4. White could try some other moves here. For example, he could play the move queen b3, but here we are in time to play knight b6, and on d4 bishop e6, kicking out the queen from b3 and playing g6 on the very next move. And as mentioned before, this is a very nice setup for black. The d4 pawn gonna be very weak thanks to the bishop on g7, and black has no weaknesses whatsoever, and white is not going to be threatening with d5 anytime soon thanks to the placement of all of our minor pieces. If white plays the move bishop b5 instead in this position, once again we can fianchetto our bishop with g6, bishop g7. That's a very ideal setup, and here white might have an idea, and that is to play the move queen a4. Now if we are playing some passive moves, white might gain the momentum to achieve a nice dynamic play, but actually there is a very nice way of taking over the initiative with black with a pawn sacrifice, and that is to play the move knight b6, and after bishop c6, that should be white's idea here, we just take back and play the move bishop d7, and we're gonna finish up the development with bishop g7, and on d4 we can play the move rook c8, and black has a very nice compensation for the pawn. We do have the pair of bishop. White does have lots of weaknesses on the light squares, and we do have some concrete ideas like bishop c6, bishop f3, and after that picking up the d4 pawn. White can play castle, we can play the move rook c8 with the idea of playing bishop c6, and once the queen retreats to e2, we can even give up the e7 pawn with castle, because after queen e7 we can go knight c4, and turns out that it's not so straightforward how to finish up development with white. If white takes on d8, we can just take back, and even though we are down 2 pawns, white just cannot really play any sensible moves here. Moves like b3 for example can be met by bishop takes f3, probably that's the best, though looking at the position knight d2 looks nice too, because there are so many weaknesses in white's position that should work out too, but bishop f3 take and just dropping back the bishop to a8 seems to be the most straightforward. There is no way for white to protect the c4 pawn, and once we get that pawn back, we still gonna be down a pawn, but there's a very good chance that we're gonna get back that last pawn as well, and we do have the pair of bishop and lots of activity to compensate for material deficit. Now let's just go back a few moves, and white could try a different direction, and that is to play queen b3 instead of the move queen a4. That would lead to a tiny bit different position. So queen b3 here. Now the d5 knight is hanging. We don't want to play e6 because that would close in our bishop on c8. So we are going to go bishop e6. Now probably queen a4 is the best for white, but he could play the move knight d4, which looks scary at first. e6 is under some pressure, and also c6 is hanging. It turns out that after the move queen d7 everything is under control. Knight e6 is answered by queen e6 check, and if white castles after knight c3, white is losing some material. So once again queen a4 probably is the idea here. And here we could play the move knight b6, and there is a chance that we would transpose to that pawn sacrifice idea after bishop c6, b takes c6, queen takes c6, bishop d7. But actually there is another idea which I wanted to show, because there is an interesting pawn structure which might arise from here on. It's important to be aware that that's something what we can also go for. So there is the move queen c7, and after the moves castle, bishop g7, white can play the move knight g5, and turns out that black cannot really move away with the bishop from e6, so we have to play something else like a6, and on knight e6, f takes e6, bishop c6, queen c6, we might end up in such situation, and even we can get queen c6, b c6 in. And here it might seem that black is in a huge trouble due to the fact that his pawn structure is just very bad, but turns out that this position is very playable. Reason being that we are ahead in terms of development. White will have a hard time to get out this bishop. The d pawn and the b pawn cannot move due to the fact that the c3 knight is hanging. The knight doesn't really want to take on d5 because that would improve black's pawn structure, and in that case it's a question how white can continue. While black has an easy play with the moves king f7, that would well protect the weak pawns on e6 and e7, and after that we have some open files available for our rooks, so the activity gonna compensate for the problematic pawn structure. Let's just go back to the beginning and let's take a look at the two main ideas available for white, and that is either bishop b5 or queen a4 checks. So we are talking about this particular position, and for example after queen a4 check we should play the move knight bd7. Now it's gonna be easy to remember everything because on bishop b5 check we're gonna have the very same reaction. And white continues with knight c3, and here we can see white's idea. Now the d5 pawn is protected, it's not hanging due to the fact that the queen is locked in, and white managed to hang on to his extra pawn. The thing is though, in the long run, for sure we're gonna get back that pawn, and once we achieve that, we're gonna be left with a better pawn structure. The ideal setup for black is to play g6, bishop g7, castle, and play a6, b5, bishop b7, and play knight b6. Obviously white will try to stop us from going there, but if we manage to get those moves in, I believe black should already be better. Black should continue with g6, in accordance with the ideal setup which I just mentioned, and after the move knight f3, by the way g3 could be another option for white, trying to put more protection towards the d5 pawn, but once again he will just not be in time to hang on to that pawn. After bishop g7, bishop g2, castle, knight e2, we just go knight b6. Now the d5 pawn already is hanging, and on queen b3 we can play bishop f5. By the way, nice idea to keep in mind, many times we can sacrifice a pawn with such idea like e6 here and claim that we're gonna have amazing activity in exchange for the pawn if white takes on e6. But bishop f5 is certainly possible without sacrificing a pawn. And after castle, bishop d3 looks like a nice move for black, and we're gonna be ready to pick up the pawn on d5, and after that black's pawn structure gonna be preferable. Now let's go back. This development with g3 is not the best. Black has multiple options to deal with that. White usually goes for the move knight f3, and after bishop g7 he develops with bishop c4. White could start off with the move queen b3, and after castle play the move bishop c4, but there is this interesting pawn sacrifice idea b5, and there are some different options. If knight takes b5, we go rook b8, a6 is a threat, queen a3, now we go knight b6, c4 bishop is hanging, d3, and we pick up the pawn on d5. We are still down a pawn, but we have a tremendous compensation. Bishop g4 is coming, we can pick up the pair of bishop with knight c4, and there is enough compensation without any doubt. Let's just go back. The b5 pawn can be picked up by the queen, for example, but here rook b8 comes with a tempo, knight b6 comes with a tempi, and on queen b3, bishop b7, now we are targeting the d5 pawn, which we're gonna get back, and after that, once again, our compensation is just gonna be amazing. White is lacking in development, there are gonna be some problems due to the fact that the queen is already targeted by the rook on b8, and also once we open up the long diagonal, it's kind of easy to see that white can get into real trouble in just a few moves. White could take on b5 with the bishop as well, but we're gonna arrive to almost a similar situation. Rook b8, now a6 is a threat, queen c4, knight b6, and follow it up with knight takes d5, bishop f5, and black is very active, and he is also ahead in development and has a better pawn structure, and with all that, the compensation is real and dangerous. If we just go back and white decides to go back with the bishop to e2, obviously it's not something to be taken seriously because here we just gain the tempi and gain some space, and here we can play a6, and that would be our ideal setup after knight b6 and bishop b7, and we are doing very well. So going back, usually white plays the move bishop c4 right away, and after castle, usually white plays the move d3. White does not want to be hit by knight b6, knight c4, so after the move d3, he would not mind that plan anymore because he could take back on c4 with the d pawn. If white plays the move queen b3, we can just play b5 just like beforehand, and we're gonna transpose to those ideas with rook b8, knight b6, a6, bishop b7, having a tremendous compensation for the pawn. So white usually goes d3 and black plays the move a6. For example, if white were to castle here, that would lose on the spot due to the fact that b5 wins a piece. White could play bishop b5 because the a6 pawn is pinned, but we have this very nice intermediate move knight b6 available, which protects the rook, attacks the queen, and the b5 bishop is still hanging. So white has to do something, and that's why usually white plays the move queen h3. Another option could be to play bishop e3 covering the b6 square, but here after knight g4 we are hitting the bishop on e3 and the bishop cannot move away because b5 is still an idea for us. So white should play queen a3 and on the move b6, now just a side note, b5 would not be such a great idea because it can be taken and we don't have knight b6 anymore, but we can play the move b6 and on castle follow it up with bishop b7 and on rook e1, which seems logical, hitting the e7 pawn, a calm rook e8 move is coming. Here if white plays the move bishop e3, black is ready to get to his ideal setup with the moves b5 and knight b6, and he's going to get back his pawn on d5. White can try to take on b6, but even with that move he's not going to save the pawn on d5, rather he just got rid of his bishop pair. Now b4 is a threat, so on queen b4 we can even drop back the queen to d8 to protect the e7 pawn and also to target the d5 pawn. And once again, we're gonna get back that pawn, and with that we're gonna open up all the diagonals for our bishops, and black has a very comfortable position. White does have another try, and that is to play the move knight g5 instead of the move bishop e3, that is here. And actually here I do have a personal experience after the move rook c8, and I was on the white side of this position, and honestly speaking that was the last time when I played the accelerated Panov attack, because after a few natural looking moves my opponent just took over the initiative and I ended up in an uncomfortable position, and I was not honestly 100% sure where I did make a mistake, and I came to the conclusion that probably in the long run black is doing quite well in these type of structures. My game went like as follows. I played the move bishop e3, knight e5 came with a tempi, now c4 is hanging. White cannot really do anything about that because the bishop cannot move due to the fact that the d3 pawn is weak as well. So I played the natural rook a d1, and here my opponent continued with h6. Knight is hanging. The knight cannot retreat to f3 because it could be just taken, so knight e4 was played. My opponent took, and only the knight can take on e4 because the c4 bishop is weak. Here my opponent took on c4, took once again, now the e4 knight is hanging, and after the moves f3, f5, black took over the initiative with the pair of bishop, and with his active position, black is definitely preferable here. If we just go back a few moves, white does have another try, and that is to try the move d6 instead of the move bishop e3, and probably that could be the idea behind this setup with bishop c4 and knight g5, but turns out that this is not dangerous at all. Black can play the calm move e6. There are some tactical ideas connected to sacrificing a piece on e6, but none of them gonna work out. There was a very instructive game where white followed up with the move bishop f4, and from here on all black moves are coming with tempi. Black played the move b5, c4 bishop is hanging, the bishop retreated, now knight c5 was played, knight d3 is the threat, rook a d1, now knight h5 was played, hitting the f4 bishop. On bishop e3 he played the move knight b3, a takes b3 and f5. Now f4 is a threat, with that g5 knight would be hanging and the e3 bishop would be hanging, so the knight had to retreat to h3, and now bishop f8 was played, targeting the weak d6 pawn. Now if we get back that pawn we would have a pair of bishop, an active position and a better pawn structure. White cannot allow that to happen, so in the game white played bishop c5 and black just followed up with a nice exchange sacrifice, rook c5, queen c5 and bishop d6, and even though we are not going to win anything back by force, but black has such a nice position. After queen e3, queen c7 once again comes with a tempi, h2 is hanging. On g3, queen c6 comes with a tempi, now checkmate is a threat. And on f3, black should have played the move e5 in my opinion, and after the possible d4, knight f6, and d5 for example, queen c7 would be a nice retreat, with the idea of playing b4, picking up the pawn on d5, with his active pieces, with bishop c5 is camming. Black once again took over the initiative and black is better. If we go back to the very beginning, besides queen a4 check, white does have another direction to go, and that is to play the move bishop b5, though the position is gonna be quite similar to those what we just looked at. So here bishop b5 check is the other try for white, and to keep everything simple, we're just gonna react the same way as we did on queen a4 check, and that is to play the move knight bd7. And here after the move knight c3, I like the idea of throwing in the move a6. Now white has to decide what to do, and all of his moves gonna have a drawback. So let's check them out. If white plays the move bishop e2, we just play b5, and on d4, we can immediately get back our pawn with b4 and knight d5, and after some natural developing moves like e6, bishop e7 and castle, after that bishop b7 seems like a nice and natural way of developing, and black should have no problem with his active position, well-placed pieces, and also with the target on d4. I did have a game on the black side where on queen b3 I played the move queen b8, which I remember I analyzed beforehand, and that was the suggestion of the engine, and I kind of liked the look of it with the idea of placing the queen on a7 and with that connecting the rooks eventually and putting pressure on the d4 pawn. I believe this position is easier to play for black. Let's just go back. Besides bishop e2, white obviously has some other options, and for example on a6, white could play the move bishop takes d7. Now this has the drawback of giving up his pair of bishop, and queen d7 seems to be a nice option for us. Maybe bishop d7 looked more natural, but actually with queen d7 we are pressing the d5 pawn immediately, and we can get out that c8 bishop later on to b7 after the move b5. So for example, after knight f3, we can take on d5, and on castle e6, knight e5, we can just include the move knight takes c3, b takes c3, queen c7, and we have the pair of bishop and very harmonious position. All we need is to finish up development. Normally that would happen without any hassle. If white tries to move d4 and on bishop d6, he goes for this tricky bishop a3 idea. I like the move bishop takes a3, and on queen a4 check, which was white's idea, b5, queen takes a3. Turns out that we cannot castle right now, but also it turns out that after the move bishop b7, bishop d5 and queen e7, we're gonna be in time to arrange our pieces to the perfect spots. Now, there is only one way for white to try to put pressure on black. If black gets bishop d5 and queen e7, he would have a nicer pawn structure, and also his bishop would be just amazing on d5. So white could try to open up the position immediately, claiming that black's king in the middle is vulnerable, and that would be with the move c4. But here after f6, actually, we will be free to take on c4, or king gonna find a shatter on f7, and with that we're gonna connect the rooks, and we still have the d5 square available for us for the bishop after the move b takes c4, and with that all of our pieces gonna be once again very well placed, and we're gonna be up a pawn on top of all those things. So going back a few moves, it turns out that white probably should try something else besides bishop d7, and that is maybe bishop a4, but here as well we have the very concrete approach, playing the move b5, and on bishop b3, playing bishop b7. Now we are ready to play knight b6, b4, taking back on d5, and there is no way for white to keep the d5 pawn alive. So after knight f3, we go b4 immediately, and we pick up the pawn on d5. And once again, we're gonna achieve a very nice position. Everything is well developed for black. We gain some space on the queen side thanks to the b5, b4 thrust, and also, as usual, white has to deal with the isolated pawn on d4, and it does not seem like he has enough dynamic counterplay to put real pressure on black. But there is only one last try for white, and that is to play the move queen a4 on the move a6, but that's not dangerous either. We can play the move rook b8, might look a little bit strange, though the plan is straightforward. We are renewing the threat on the b5 bishop. If the bishop retreats, we do have b5, knight b6, bishop b7, taking on d5, playing on b4, the usual moves. With that, we would achieve a very nice position. And on the move bishop d7, this time around, probably the best is to take back on d7 with the bishop, because this counts with a tempi. Now white can move his queen to two different spots. If he goes to f4, I will advise a pawn sacrifice with e6. This is an idea what we have seen was possible in some other positions as well, trying to finish up our development and open up the position for a pair of bishop. After the moves d takes e6, bishop e6, followed by bishop d6, black has a very comfortable play. White could try some other moves like knight f3 here without opening up the position, but in that case we are just going to grab our pawn back, and after castle, bishop e7, knight e5, we can even just castle, give back the pair of bishop but with that also neutralizing all white's initiative which he might have. If the queen retreats to a different spot, and probably that is b3, here we can once again go for e6, though I would mention that b5 is also possible with the idea of b4 and trying to grab back the pawn on d5. But once again, e6 is very possible. Now d takes e6 would be met by bishop e6 with a tempi, so probably white should play something else, and that is d4. But here we can take on d5, and even in such scenario we are down a pawn, but with the pair of bishop and with the initiative going on, we are doing very well. And even concretely here, after the moves bishop b4 check, turns out that white is not in time to finish up his development, and his king gonna stuck in the middle, and with that black is achieving a very nice position. In this line, white really should not be greedy, and he should not take on d5 with the queen. He can try to develop with knight f3, and that's the better option for him, but once again, black has no problem whatsoever after the move bishop d6, castle, and getting the bishop out from d7 to some more active squares like f5 or b5, depending how the game continues. It's kind of apparent that black has no problem whatsoever. I will just mention that if I see some chances for the accelerated Panov attack, usually that's a sign for me that I really should play the Caro-Kann, because in the long run, I really believe that strategically speaking, black is doing very well, so we just have to be aware of our precise move order and how we can position our pieces, and if we know those things, there's a good chance that we might even end up in a better position out of the opening. So definitely the accelerated Panov attack is not something to be afraid of.